let me tell you what we're going to be going
Yeah,
to.
tell me what
might
you...
actually starting there. I mean, this is a show about Louisiana politics and New Orleans politics, and just, you know, there are a lot of folks that say that our politics down here has a lot of uniqueness, at least on the surface level. And so the show is about what makes Louisiana and New Orleans politics the way they are, and, you know, what are the consequences. You know, I mean, what's Louisiana and New Orleans like?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about this until you just mentioned it. And in many respects, I don't think it's unique, and in some ways it is. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with the history of how it evolved. The President of the United States is a Yale graduate, and he's a blue blood. And I guess in Louisiana, you have the complete antithesis of what kinds of social classes evolved to position of political influence. So I think Huey Long probably put the stamp on the political identity of Louisiana, and he was perceived by people to be a populist. And so that there is some conscious or unconscious idea that people who evolve to political office are populists, and they come from poor, destitute social classes as opposed to a more elitist type of ascension to public office. In that sense, I think it's part of the political ideology of the country to think that the poor and the Cinderella types can evolve to position of power. And probably here more than any other state and in any other city, politics is a huge part of the culture. There's music, food, the carnival tradition, unique architectural style, which comes from the confluence of European and African immigrations to this part of the United States. And it's very much a part of the culture. And probably the only way most people can perceive a way of evolving to any kind of socioeconomic status in the city or the state. They perceive it that way, I think, maybe more so than other places in terms of a statewide or citywide phenomenon. And for minority groups, clearly it's the only avenue where you can become, or it is perceived that you can become part of the mainstream. So that gives it an importance, which may not be true in other states. I think it's true overall, but it has a unique color and flavor here because of the richness of the culture. New Orleans is, and I think state Louisiana is really extremes of everything. The music is unique, and the whole sense of, I think, anti-intellectualism is also in the extreme here. Race plays a big factor. Theology and religion plays a huge factor. There's a dichotomy here between the north and southern portions of the state. There is an extremes of poverty, and at the same time, this is a state which had a huge reservoir of natural resources. Now, they were exploited to the detriment of the people who live here. All of the value added for most of the natural resources took place somewhere else. I think the cultural aesthetic is more focused on having a good time. It's probably more important to people who live in this state than saying being the most intellectually astute, the most corporately efficient, well-financed, the most astute business community vis-a-vis other states. I think the whole idea of having a good time, laissez-faire, having a carnival, Mardi Gras disposition, and that kind of a mentality is here. It's also a very conservative, very reactionary place, and it's an anti-intellectual place, and it resists change to the ultimate. I mean, it functions in a kind of crisis management style, and it continues to regurgitate things that it's familiar with. So if a politician gets to office, everybody focuses on the retention and the concerns that these personalities have. It's cultism in many respects. It I think, encourages egomania on the part of a lot of its politicians, and they tend to be personalities over and above whatever influence they might try to exercise. And because of that cultural characteristic, the voters and the constituencies are very deferential to all kinds of eccentric behavior. And they're not concerned about how important it is to democratize the process and to be sure that the leadership is ongoing, that it's new and different and innovative. They expect long-serving politicians to continue to be visionaries at the same time. And of course, human nature being what it is, that's very unlikely. So they're very resistant to change, and their politics tends to focus on certain kind of cultism, kind of personality, egomania, if you will.
There's a couple of things that you said that struck chords. Also, my questions are not going to be in this thing. So when I ask you a question, if you can incorporate the question into the answer, like,
I see.
Do you have examples of that? I mean, is that part of the cultism that you're talking about?
Oh yes, I mean that's in Louisiana there are family dynasties, which people sort of take for granted. The Long family is a good example of that. My brother ran for public office, and he replaced a man by the name of Dan Haggerty, whose family had had that position for 50 years. Dutch Moriah, when he decided he was going to step away from office, talked about the impact of his action on his children, as if to suggest that it's perfectly acceptable to people and to the voters that people who accrue to public office should continue to pass this on to relatives. Of course, there is a mayor in Chicago by the name of Daley. So in that sense, New Orleans may not be unique, but there certainly is an assumption here that the way you accrue to prosperity is to pursue your personal interests through political channels. And that's part of the problem, I think. I think many politicians tend to see public service as a vehicle for personal gain, for personal prosperity. That's not different, that's not unique. I mean, that happens all over America. But the sense of the need for continuity of change, to institutionalize change is not, I think, very important here. It's only a sense of crisis which provokes a realization on the part of people that there needs to be a change. And when politicians stay in office, eventually I think you start getting abuses of their influence, and it gets to a point where it becomes very controversial.
With what people expect out of it, or what they're willing to tolerate from the politicians, is nice, because it's a nice counterbalance to some of the other things we're getting into, the fun-filled Louisiana politics, because all politics have consequences, good or bad.
Yeah. There is the media. I mean, they define personalities as news, and they tend to build their emphasis about.
New Orleans itself has an interesting tradition. I mean, this is where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded. This is an area of intense civil rights activity. And it's a city where black politics has progressed, at least on a superficial level, quite far. Not only one black mayor, but a second black mayor, a majority black city council. Has black politics and the rise of black politics made much of a difference in New Orleans?
My answer to that is it's the continuation of the civil rights struggle. And it's the only avenue blacks have at this point. I don't think you can build an economic infrastructure for the minority community except through the pursuit of the public sector. And that's why the whole issue of affirmative action becomes important. There's no corporate community in New Orleans to speak of, black or white. And just like the rest of America, the corporate community is subsidized to a great extent by the public sector. And to the extent that that's true for whites, it has to be even more important for blacks, and unless they are in positions of political influence, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to develop the kind of economic self-sufficiency it takes for a community to prosper. So I think in America there's got to be an over-reliance in a transition on the part of minorities to deal in the public sector. And I don't see that there's any other alternative for them. Corporate America may behave more desirably at some point in the future, but in the immediate sense, I think the focus is always going to be on what blacks and minorities can get out of the public sector. Now, this is a very unique town because the economy is so terrible for everybody. It's an oil-driven state that happens to be a weak sector in the state and in the nation as a whole. And so I don't see that blacks have any alternative but to pursue economic development vis-a-vis support from the public sector.
Is there an irony then that in a state with colorful, eccentric, if not crazy white politicians in the past, that now that you're electing black public officials, there's a fair number of black officials which may not be as crazy, but are as colorful and sometimes questionable as the politicians in the past?
Well, I think that's right. I don't think that it's interesting. What's implied in the question of whether or not blacks or whites behave the same in public office is an assumption that blacks are different. They may. I doubt that they're very different. There's some differences which I think we ought to appreciate, and they are important. But I think people who get into public office have to be held accountable, regardless of what their race happens to be, and their constituency have that responsibility. Blacks have the same temptations. They may be more desperate about the pursuit of economic gain, and therein lies the temptations for abuse and for a denial of the needs of the constituency that they seek to serve. But I think the American political system encourages a certain kind of egomania, and it's not an astute, very sophisticated, very intellectual way of dealing with problems. Politics in Louisiana tend to be anti-intellectual because that's the whole tenor of the culture here. There's really no appreciation for the value of education. And as a consequence, you will see the state continuing to have economic problems until it begins to address the educational problems. And I don't see any appreciation for the importance of that on any level of government. I think it's an acute need that's confronting the state as a whole and the minority community in particular.
We had a talk, I guess, on Sunday with a number of people who were instrumental in the formation of COOP, all graduates of St. Augustine High School. You know, and a lot of folks that are now in the hierarchy in City Hall and in politics all come from, at least it seems like, come from that small group of folks in a few high school classes. Does that represent an advance for the city, progress for the city politically?
Well, the answer to that is both yes and no. Clearly, it's a departure from the past, but as people who get involved in political office, we have to be responsible for the largest number of citizens in the community, black or white. In this city, in New Orleans, the great majority of those people happen to be poor, financially poor, poorly educated, and with very little resources. Most of them are either unemployed or underemployed. They don't own their own homes and so forth and so on. And the challenge and responsibility of urban politics is to serve that constituency. And there's a larger context which is disturbing, and that is it may be that as time goes by in a place like New Orleans, the white community may move out into outlying areas. And I don't think blacks will have very much leverage to govern the urban city unless something is done to address that trend. There's always steam control, but you have to have some kind of vision of what's going to be needed in terms of leadership in the future that's going to establish an accord between races as well as economic entities in and outside of the city.
Campaigns in Louisiana are said to be unique. There's an enormous amount of money spent in the mayor's election. I believe the money that the present mayor and his challenger spent was more per capita than any mayor's election in the history of the United States.
Right.
At the same time, there's been an explosion of political organizations. What is it about campaigns, and are campaigns just another way of economic development in the city?
Well, campaigns cost money because the media charges a lot, and the perception is that in order to get elected, you have to run very sophisticated media campaigns. You have to have consultants and polls, and you have to get on television. And that's a phenomenon which was not anticipated by the founding fathers. They have no idea how to deal with the presence of the media and its impact
But,
on
in other
electoral
cities
politics.
and other states, there's not as much use of TV. I mean, here we have people running for district court judge who use TV. We have coroners
Right.
using TV.
Right.
Why so much more here?
Well, because that's the legacy of Huey Long. Huey left a system with a whole lot of duplicity, and as a result, everybody is forced to run for public office. You have two of everything here, and as a consequence, the system is a lot more expensive to do. But I think campaign reforms need to be had all over the country. I think you have to limit terms in office, you have to limit spending, and you have to limit contributions in order to keep the system open and to keep it dynamic enough to get the kinds of public policy and operational forms of government that needs to serve the greatest number of people.
Where does the money come to fuel all these campaigns and all this media stuff?
Well, the money comes from the people who have it, and the people who have it tend to be the business communities, or some of the labor groups have PACs, and that's where the bulk of the money comes from. Most of the black candidates get 75, 80% of their money from white interests, and as a consequence, they have a dilemma of, at the same time, wanting to help minority constituency, but on the other hand, being sensitive to the needs that if they're going to stay in office, they need to solicit contributions from people who may be in conflict with that minority interest, so that the business community really fuels the politics of urban America, and in particularly a city like this.
There has been something that other people have told us, and that there's so much money in these campaigns, and so much of it that doesn't go into the media goes out in the streets, that this is sort of like a low-scale redistribution of income.
Well, if it is, it's certainly insufficient to do what needs to be done, and it's too infrequent and too small to be of any consequence to make a substantial change in the political economy of everybody who needs to change their life and circumstances in a city like New Orleans and in a state like Louisiana. I mean, there's got to be some basic changes in the infrastructure of the economy, both locally and nationally. There's got to be a basic restructuring of how government functions. But that presumes that there has to be a change in the mindset and in the political and intellectual mentality of the people who live in the state. You have a terrific resistance here, say, to the idea of gambling as a way of generating revenues. But there's gambling all over the state. The church gambles, and yet you can't get a referendum passed in the state legislature to consider this as an option. Now, if the United States government can guarantee investments in, say, a country like Poland, it would make sense for the state of Louisiana to use a pool of money generated by gambling to guarantee investments in your state and to dedicate portion of that revenue, say, to education and so forth. But I think if you used it to guarantee investments, you'd be able to build a corporate infrastructure which would generate the kind of tax base you need to provide public services. It makes no sense for a state not to consider, even on a limited basis, with a sundown clause in it for, say, a period of 10 to 15 years to generate the kind of revenue it needs to help build up its economic infrastructure. But the only way to explain why that doesn't happen is because the politics are out of sync, the mentality is out of sync with any rational approach to what needs to be done.
Now, this is a statement on political leaders. I mean, in general, I realize there are wide ranges of what political leaders are, but for you in your context, how would you describe most political leaders and politicians in Louisiana?
Self-interested. I would think that would probably describe most of them to me, that they're not interested in what they ought to be. For the most part, there are some exceptions, but I think most of them are driven by a desire to satisfy some personal gain or some ego needs, rather than to be concerned about the long-range prosperity of the people in the state. And that's very tragic. Now, I don't mean to diminish the efforts of the exceptional people who want to see some change for the most desirable kind of reasons. But I think they're in a minority anywhere in America, and I don't see that New Orleans or Louisiana stands out in this sense. But it may mean, and I hate to think that this would be true, it may mean that the only people who are willing to make change are people who already have wealth and who therefore see the need to change because they want to either sustain that wealth or they've realized that there has to be more in life than just having money. Or people who are purely altruistic in almost all of their human activities. And those are very rare people, and those are not the kind of people who gravitate to public office.
Let me ask you one last thing about campaigns in New Orleans. You know, back in the 60s, late 60s, you began to have political organizations, coup, bold. So now in a political election, there are literally hundreds of campaign organizations, Smooth, Bears, Yappa. This is very unique to New Orleans. Why do we have hundreds of political organizations?
Well, I think that's it may be part of some sense of opportunism, so that people see elections as an opportunity to make money. It's also a way for them to get involved in the political process, because they've seen Soul and Coup and other organizations, at least there is the perception that they have done well pursuing this route of prosperity. And so I think that's part of the motivation. The other thing is that it's out of control. Nobody controls the voters. There was a time when a few politicians and a few organizations thought that they could control the voters and they would control the impact on any given election. But now I don't think anyone controls the voters, and people are beginning to see that pursuing politics is the only way that they can think of to look after their own personal economic development or their own personal financial objectives, whatever they happen to be. And so I think you get a proliferation of that. And I don't think that there is any individual or organization that will have lasting control over these voters. I think the media develops a certain kind of personality, a political personality, and they focus on those individuals, and as a result, they may have some temporary influence on what voters tend to do. It becomes personality campaigns rather than issue campaigns, and that's unfortunate.
One last thing for me. I want you to repeat the beginning of a sentence and complete it for me. Louisiana politics is. So starting with Louisiana politics is.
Well, it's a conundrum.
Let's start with Louisiana politics is.
Louisiana politics is confusion. It's anti-intellectual. It's laissez-faire, and it's out of whack with the realities of the modern world.
Louis, Andy?
Nope.
That's fine. Thank you.
Oh, I have one
Yes,
question.
oh.
I have one question. Do you think that the politics in Louisiana is any more corrupt than it is in any other part of the country?
No. Well, it depends on what you mean by is it more corrupt. For instance, I think that you may find states where the taxpayer gets more mileage, more bang for his buck in terms of public services. You might get higher levels of efficiency in certain governmental agencies in some states or some cities than you would, say, in some Louisiana cities. You may find more duplicity of public agencies in Louisiana than you would in other states or other cities. But the tendency of people to abuse in politics and to abuse public office the idea of having your institutions, your public institutions, do things that would be considered undesirable. I think it's pervasive in American body politics. There isn't an institution in Washington which has not been discredited because of some kind of corruption or scandal. The Watergate scandal, for instance, touched every aspect of the national government. You have Oliver Norths all over the place, and I think the Reagan administration probably got more people indicted than any administrations prior to the presidency. I don't think Louisiana is unique in that sense. I think the nature of American politics feeds on corruption, and it's a big part of any analysis anyone chooses to make about what needs to be done. No, I don't think New Orleans is, I don't think Louisiana is unique in that sense. It has its own brand of American politics, but it's no more and no less corrupt than any place else. It's different, but it's different in style rather than substance.
That was great. Good question. Thank you very much.
Room tone, please.
Just be quiet for about 20 seconds.